There is a kind of poverty that doesn't just live in the wallet. It lives in the walls. In the way a house settles at night, groaning under the weight of everything it holds. In the smell of boiled rice stretched thin across 4 bowls. In the silence after a child asks a question you don't have the answer to. Margaret Elaine Holloway knew that kind of poverty intimately. She had known it so long it had stopped feeling like suffering and started feeling like simply the shape of her life. She lived on the far edge of a small town called Crestfield, in a pale yellow house that had once been white. The paint had given up years ago, peeling back from the wooden siding like the pages of an old book, exposing the gray underneath. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. The garden, if you could call it that, was mostly dandelions and stubborn clover, though in the spring. 3 rose bushes, one for each boy, pushed red and pink blooms up through the chaos like they were making a point. Margaret was 53 now. Her hair, once the deep auburn of river clay in summer, had gone mostly silver. She wore it pinned back with the same type of clip she had used for 30 years. Her hands were rough, not in a careless way, in the way of someone who had worked every single day of their adult life without complaint and without ceremony. She had worked checkout at Dunmore's grocery for 11 years. She had cleaned offices on weekend nights. She had taken in alterations and mending. She had done what needed to be done. That was simply who she was. But now she sat in a courtroom, and the fluorescent lights above her hummed at a frequency that felt almost personal in its cruelty. The wood of the defendant's chair was cold against her back. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers pressed together, knuckle to knuckle. She was wearing the navy dress she had bought at a thrift store for her sister's funeral 8 years ago. It still fit. She had not gained much weight over the years. She hadn't always had the luxury of eating enough to gain it. Across the room, on the other side of a polished table that cost more than her car, sat Gerald Hartwell and his legal team. Gerald Hartwell was 61, wide-shouldered, silver-haired in the way that reads as distinguished rather than weathered. He wore a charcoal suit. His attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Bryce Calloway, shuffled papers with the practiced ease of someone who had never once lost sleep over a case. The lawsuit was straightforward, at least on paper. Gerald Hartwell was claiming that Margaret Holloway had illegally occupied and made structural changes to a property on Linnet Road that he had purchased 3 years prior. He was suing for damages. Significant damages. The kind of number that appeared on the court documents in cold, clean font and made Margaret's stomach hollow every time she read it. She had lived on that property for 19 years. She had raised 3 boys there. 3 boys who were not born from her body, but who had grown from the marrow of her devotion, as surely as if they had been. The story of how they came to her was not dramatic in the way people expect dramatic things to be. There was no single event, no burning building, no traffic accident with a dying stranger pressing a baby into her arms. It was slower than that, more honest. The first boy, James, had been left at the county shelter when he was 4. His mother had walked through the front door with him, set his backpack down beside him, a small green thing with a cartoon frog on it, and had not walked back out with him. Margaret had been volunteering there on a Tuesday afternoon, sorting donated clothing when she heard him. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't wailing. He was just making this small, continuous sound. Low and rhythmic, like a hum that had nowhere to go. She walked over and sat beside him on the floor. She didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did he. She signed the foster papers 3 weeks later. The second boy, Darius, came to her at age 6, 2 years after James. He had been in 2 homes before hers. He arrived with bruised ribs and a mistrust of adult voices that was so deep it lived in his posture. He flinched when doors closed too fast. He ate quickly, protectively, like someone might take the plate away. Margaret never made a performance of being gentle with him. She was just gentle, consistently, every day. The way the sun rises, not because it is trying to prove something, but because that is its nature. Within a year, Darius was the loudest person at the dinner table. The third boy, Solomon, came to her as a newborn, technically. 7 weeks old, placed through emergency fostering because his young mother had gone into crisis, and there was simply no one else. Margaret had been 40 years old, working double shifts, running a household on her own, and a social worker named Patricia Osei had called her at 9 in the evening and said, simply, "Margaret." I wouldn't ask if there was anyone else. She had driven to the agency in her winter coat over her pajamas and come home with a baby boy wrapped in a yellow blanket. She had fostered all three, and over the years, through a process that cost her in legal fees she could barely afford, she had adopted all three. She had no husband. She had no family money. She had a woman at her church who watched the boys on Tuesday evenings, and a neighbor named Harold who fixed her car when it broke down and asked for nothing in return. She had raised them in the house on Linnet Road. She had painted their rooms. She had stayed up through fevers. She had sat with James through nightmares that lasted until the sky turned gray. She had coached Darius through his reading. He was dyslexic, and the school had labeled him slow, and Margaret had gone to that school and sat across from a principal and said, in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely immovable, that her son was not slow. He was brilliant, and he needed specific support. And she would sit in this office every week until that support was provided. She had taught Solomon to cook. He had taken to it with a seriousness that made her laugh, the way he would taste a sauce and tilt his head like a small professor. All of this every meal, every argument, every first day of school, every report card. Every birthday cake made from a box mix and decorated with whatever frosting she could afford. All of it had happened in that house on Linnet Road. And Gerald Hartwell wanted $67,000 from her. His claim was that she had built a small addition onto the rear of the property, without proper permits, during a period when the property's ownership had been disputed following the death of the original landlord. He claimed the addition constituted an unlawful structural modification. He claimed she had no right to have remained in the property through the ownership transition. His attorneys had documentation. They had photographs. They had a surveyor's report. Margaret's court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Angela Torres who had graduated law school 2 years prior and still wore a small enamel pin of a Scales of Justice on her lapel, had been working the case as hard as she could. But the case was not going well. Margaret knew this. She could read a room. She had been reading rooms her whole life out of necessity. That morning she had woken before sunrise. She had made herself tea in the yellow kitchen of the pale house that was no longer technically hers to inhabit. She had sat at the table and looked at the 3 chairs where her sons used to sit, smaller, louder, more complicated and wonderful than anything she had ever imagined her life might hold. She had not cried. She was past crying about this. She was in the stage of grief that exists just beyond tears, where things simply feel very, very still. She had put on the navy dress. She had pinned her hair back. She had driven to the courthouse in the car that was making a new noise she hadn't had the money to diagnose. She had taken her seat. Now the morning session was about to resume after a brief recess. Angela Torres was shuffling through her notes with an expression of concentrated anxiety. Bryce Calloway was laughing quietly at something his associate had said. Gerald Hartwell straightened his cuffs. The courtroom doors opened. Not one person walked in. 3. 3 men side by side, carrying briefcases and leather document folders, wearing suits that spoke of a particular, serious, earned kind of success. They entered the room with the unhurried confidence of people who understood exactly where they were and exactly why they had come. The first was tall, broad across the shoulders, with deep-set eyes and a close-trimmed beard going slightly gray at the jaw. He moved like someone who had once been a frightened child and had grown, through specific effort and time, into someone who would never be frightened again. His name was James Holloway. He was 28 years old and a licensed civil rights attorney with a firm based in Atlanta. The second was slightly shorter, built like a man who moved through the world with something to prove and had long since proven it. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a habit. His name was Darius Holloway. He was 26, and he was a property law specialist, one of the sharper ones in the state of Georgia. His supervising partner had once noted in a review, who had spent the last 4 years handling exactly this kind of case. Exactly this kind. The third was the youngest, lean, quieter in his bearing, with eyes that took in a room the way a careful chef tastes a dish, thoroughly, attentively, missing nothing. His name was Solomon Holloway. He was 24 and had passed the bar 14 months ago. He was the junior attorney among them. He was also, as anyone who had spent 20 minutes in a room with him could tell you, not going to be junior for long. They did not go to the gallery. They walked directly to the defendant's table. Angela Torres looked up, startled, as James set his briefcase down beside hers and said quietly, "Ms. Torres, we're co-counsel, effective this morning. I believe you received our filing." She had. She had received it at 7:40 that morning and had stared at it for a long moment before understanding what she was looking at. Margaret Elaine Holloway had not known they were coming. She had told them about the case in passing, in the way she told them about most of her problems, minimizing it, framing it as something she was handling, not wanting to be a weight. She had raised them to be self-sufficient. She had not raised them to carry her. But they had found out the full scope of it 3 weeks ago when Darius, calling to wish her happy birthday, had heard something in her voice. That specific flatness. That careful steadiness she deployed when something was very wrong. He had asked her 3 times if she was sure she was all right. She had said yes 3 times. He had called James from the parking lot of his office building before he even reached his car. They had spent 3 weeks preparing, quietly, without telling her. Now James placed one hand on her shoulder briefly, firmly, and then took his seat. Darius sat beside him, already opening his folder. Solomon sat on her other side and looked at her, and his expression was not performative. It was not meant to be read by anyone else in the room. It was the face of a man looking at the person who made him possible. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Margaret looked at him, then at Darius. Then at James, who was already reviewing notes with the focused intensity she recognized. She had seen it at kitchen tables, in the lamplight, over textbooks and practice tests. She had sat across from that concentration 100 times, whispering words of encouragement he barely heard, because he was already somewhere inside the problem. Her eyes did not fill with tears. Something happened that was quieter than tears, something internal like a tide shifting. She straightened her back. She folded her hands again in her lap, but differently now. Not in the posture of someone bracing for impact, in the posture of someone who is no longer alone. When the judge entered and the session came to order, Bryce Calloway looked at the defendant's table with an expression that recalibrated in real time. He leaned toward Hartwell and said something low. Hartwell's expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. James stood. He introduced himself, Darius, and Solomon in the formal cadence of the courtroom, each name and credential offered with clean precision. Then he said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission. We'd like to begin with a foundational matter regarding the property history on Linnet Road that we believe has been significantly misrepresented in the plaintiff's documentation." What followed was not a dramatic courtroom speech. It was better than that. It was methodical. Darius laid out the property records, the ownership dispute following the original landlord's death, the specific legal frameworks around adverse possession. The documented history of Margaret's continuous, open, and notorious residency going back 19 years. He cited cases, he cited statutes. He moved through the documents with the confidence of someone who had grown up watching a woman be underestimated and had decided, at some point he could not precisely name, to become someone who could dismantle that specific injustice with specific tools. Solomon handled the counterclaims around the addition, presenting permit documentation that Angela Torres had not been able to locate and structural assessments that reframed the modification entirely. His argument was careful, almost spare. He said exactly what needed to be said and nothing beyond it. James cross-examined the plaintiff's surveyor. He was patient. He was thorough. He let the man establish his credentials, let him explain his methodology, let him settle into the comfort of his own expertise. And then, slowly, with the measured precision of someone dismantling a structure from its foundation upward, he walked him through 3 specific inconsistencies in the measurements. The surveyor stumbled on the second one. He recalculated on the third. By the time James was finished, the survey report that had served as the cornerstone of Hartwell's claim had the credibility of wet paper. Bryce Calloway objected twice. Both objections were overruled. During the lunch recess, Margaret sat in a small room adjacent to the courtroom with her 3 sons around a table. Someone had brought sandwiches. No one was particularly hungry. James was reviewing the afternoon strategy with Darius. Solomon was refilling her water cup. She looked at them, at the men they had become, at the weight of how far each of them had traveled from where they had started. James, who had hummed into the air of a shelter hallway as a 4-year-old, and been answered by a woman who sat down on the floor beside him. Darius, who had flinched at closing doors, who had eaten fast and low over his plate, who now sat with his elbows on a table, and his voice filling the room without apology. Solomon, who had arrived in a yellow blanket at 9 o'clock on a winter night, and had grown into a man with a careful mind, and a quiet power that felt, to her, like something she had been trusted to protect until it was ready. She said softly, "You didn't have to do this." James looked up from his notes. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, we did." Darius did not look up. He said without any particular inflection, "Eat your sandwich, Mom." She laughed. It was small and brief and real, and it moved through the room like a window opening. The afternoon session concluded with the judge indicating she would take the presented materials under advisement and issue a ruling within 10 days. It was not the immediate vindication of a movie courtroom. It was quieter than that, more honest. But before the session ended, as Bryce Calloway made his final remarks and gestured once more toward the damages figure, James stood and requested a brief additional statement. The judge permitted it. He stood at the table. He did not perform. He spoke plainly. He said that the woman sitting in that chair had, for 20 years, made decisions that cost her personally in every measurable way, so that 3 children who had been left without safety or stability could have both. He said she had done it not because anyone required it of her, not because of financial gain. Her circumstances made that argument absurd, but because she had looked at 3 human beings in need and had decided that she was the answer. He said the property on Linnet Road was not a disputed asset. It was the place where 3 men had been raised into who they were. He said that whatever the legal outcome of the specific claims before the court, he wanted the record to reflect that. He sat down. The judge looked at Margaret for a moment, just a moment. Then she looked back at her papers. Hartwell's attorney did not make eye contact with his client. In the days that followed, while they waited for the ruling, Margaret went back to her routines. She worked her shifts. She made her tea in the morning. She watered the rose bushes. The boys called. James called every evening, brief and professional in his manner but present. Darius texted long, rambling updates about the legal precedents. He was monitoring that she only half understood but read every word of. Solomon called on Sunday, and they talked about nothing important for 40 minutes. About a soup she had taught him to make, about a book he was reading, about whether the left porch step needed replacing. She did not talk to them about fear. She had never been very good at that. But in the early mornings, before the day required her attention, she sat with her tea, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened in that courtroom. Not the legal proceedings, the other thing, the thing that had no official name, the thing that happens when a life's worth of quiet, unwitnessed effort is suddenly, briefly witnessed. She had never done any of it to be witnessed. That was important. She had done it because James had hummed into the air and no one else had sat down. She had done it because Darius had flinched, and she knew what it meant to need someone to simply be consistent. She had done it because a baby in a yellow blanket had been placed in her arms at 9 o'clock on a winter night, and she had felt, in some wordless and fundamental way, that this was hers to do. The ruling came on a Thursday, 10 days later, while she was at work. Angela Torres called her during her break. The judge had found in Margaret's favor on the primary claims. The damages suit was dismissed. The modification issue was resolved in her favor under the documented permit records Solomon had uncovered. She was staying in her home. She stood in the break room of Dunmore's grocery in her apron, holding the phone against her ear. The refrigerator hummed. The fluorescent light buzzed, the same frequency as the courtroom but somehow softer here, more familiar. Outside the small window, she could see the parking lot and beyond it a strip of sky the color of a river in late afternoon. She said, "Thank you, Angela." Her voice was steady. She finished her shift. She drove home in the car that was still making that noise she hadn't diagnosed. She pulled into the driveway of the pale yellow house. She sat for a moment before getting out. The rose bushes were in the last of their late-season bloom, slightly ragged now, a little wind-torn but still producing color with a stubbornness that felt, if she let herself think about it, a little like her own. She went inside. She made rice. She set 4 bowls out of habit, then looked at the 3 empty chairs and left them. There are things in this world that no institution documents. No court record captures. No ruling affirms or denies. The way a woman in an apron sits down on a shelter floor beside a child who is humming because he has no other language for his pain. The way that same woman, 30 years later, sits at a kitchen table in a pale yellow house and understands, for the first time in a very long time, that the life she quietly built in the margins of the world she was given was not invisible. It had just been waiting to be seen by the right eyes. And those eyes had learned to see in her kitchen, at her table, under the sound of her voice reading stories after lights out, under the weight of her steady, unspectacular, extraordinary love. Some people build things out of ambition, out of legacy, out of the need to leave a mark. Margaret Holloway had built 3 men. And on a Thursday in October, in a courtroom with humming lights and cold wooden chairs, those 3 men had walked through a door. Not to rescue her, to return what she had given them.